$48,700 was the price tag hanging over my son's life like a countdown clock. In the cold hospital air, everything sounded louder. The beeping monitors, the rushing footsteps, my own heartbeat trying not to panic. I was a cleaner with aching hands and an empty wallet, the kind of woman people look past in hallways. But that day, I wasn't invisible. I was desperate. When the deadline came, I didn't get a miracle. I got something sharper. A man walked in wearing silence like a suit, clean lines, cold eyes, the kind of presence that makes a room straighten itself. He didn't bargain or hesitate. The bill was paid in seconds, as if $48,700 meant nothing. Relief hit me so hard I almost collapsed, until I realized help like that never comes free. Because he didn't rescue me and walk away. He paid, then claimed one thing in return, a promise. And the moment I understood who he really was, the Korean Mafia boss, my gratitude turned into fear, because I remembered the one mistake that made him notice me in the first place. I had fallen asleep in his chair. I had learned how to live on numbers long before the hospital put one in front of me. Rent, bus fare, rice, the small coins that gathered at the bottom of my bag like guilt. I scrubbed floors until my wrists burned, smiled at supervisors who never remembered my name, and took every extra shift they offered because that's what good mothers did, what desperate mothers did. I did everything people say you're supposed to do. I worked. I stayed quiet. I didn't ask for help unless I had no choice. And still, my son was getting sicker. Haeyeon looked too small under the hospital blanket, his eyelashes resting against cheeks that had lost their warmth. Every breath he took felt borrowed. I sat beside him with my hands folded so tightly my fingers went numb, as if holding myself together could hold him here too. The air smelled like disinfectant and metal, and the light above us was too white, too honest. It showed every crack in me. When the nurse returned, her face didn't carry sympathy anymore. It carried procedure. The kind of calm that meant decisions had already been made. She explained it the same way you would explain a closed door. Treatment could not continue without payment. Not later, not tomorrow. Now, there were policies, deadlines, forms that didn't care how hard I worked or how good my intentions were. I remember nodding like I understood, even as my mind splintered. I checked my phone with shaking hands, scrolling through messages that didn't exist, people I could call who wouldn't pick up, family who had already given what they could, friends who were surviving just like me. I counted what was in my account anyway, like doing the math twice might change the answer. It didn't. My stomach hollowed out with the quiet realization that love wasn't enough to buy time. I stepped out into the corridor because I couldn't cry in front of Haeyeon. My uniform still smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, and I hated myself for it, like I had brought my poverty into a place that demanded payment and dignity in the same breath. The receptionist's desk was just ahead, the bill on the counter like a verdict waiting for my signature. That was when the air shifted. A shadow fell across the paperwork, sharp, deliberate, and I felt it before I looked up. A man in a black suit stood there as if he'd always belonged in that space, as if urgency had no right to touch him. He didn't fumble for a wallet. He didn't ask questions. He moved with the certainty of someone used to being obeyed. And the moment his card touched the counter, the entire front desk changed. Voices lowered, backs straightened, eyes flicked away, because they recognized exactly who had just paid. The receipt printer chirped like nothing in the world had changed, like a child wasn't fighting to stay alive a few doors away. A thin strip of paper slid out, and the nurse behind the desk stared at it as if it were something dangerous. I stared too, because my brain couldn't accept what my eyes were seeing. Paid, stamped in red so bold it looked unreal. The man didn't even watch the numbers. He watched me. His face was calm in a way that made my skin tighten. Not kind calm, not gentle calm. The calm of someone who never needed to rush because the world always made room. He took the receipt between gloved fingers and folded it once precisely, then set it down like a signature. "Sir," the receptionist started, voice too soft. He silenced her without a word, just a glance. The entire counter went quiet. My throat burned. Relief tried to rise, but fear swallowed it halfway. People like this didn't step in out of generosity. They stepped in because they could, and because they wanted something in return. I forced my voice to work. Why? The word came out raw. Why would you? He held my gaze for a long moment, and in it I felt measured. Not just as a mother, not as a woman, but as an answer to a question he hadn't asked out loud. I don't do charity, he said at last, his tone low enough that it stayed between us. Charity makes people careless. I flinched because it wasn't what I expected, but it felt true in the worst way. He leaned closer, not invading, just closing the distance the way a lock clicks into place. I do promises. My hands trembled at my sides. I thought of Haeyeon. I thought of the hospital room and the way his little fingers curled around mine as if I was the only safe thing left. Whatever this man wanted, it couldn't be worth my child's life. Yet my child's life was the only thing I couldn't afford to lose. What promise? I asked, because pretending I had a choice was the only dignity I could cling to. His eyes didn't soften. When I call, you answer. I swallowed. When I say come, he continued, you come. The hallway sounds seemed to fade, leaving only the quiet weight of his words. He held up a single finger, as if counting rules in a world where rules were weapons. And you tell no one I helped. My lips parted, but no protest came. The bill was paid. My son could breathe. My pride could burn later. I agree, I whispered, adding how small my voice sounded. He studied me as if checking for cracks. Then he spoke even more softly, like a warning meant only for my ears. This promise is for your son's safety, and yours. It should have ended at the hospital counter, with relief and a whispered thank you I didn't know how to shape. But the way he looked at me, like he'd seen me before, pulled a memory up from somewhere I'd tried to bury under exhaustion. 2 nights ago, I'd finished a double shift that left my legs hollow and my thoughts slow, the kind of fatigue that makes the world tilt at the edges. The building I cleaned after hours was not like the places I usually worked. The lobby smelled expensive, not like perfume, but like polished stone and money. The elevator required a key card, and the floor it unlocked felt quieter than the rest of the city. As if even sound needed permission to exist there. I wasn't supposed to linger. I wasn't supposed to touch anything that didn't belong to my cart. But the executive level was a museum of perfection. Glass that never showed fingerprints, floors that reflected your face, desks arranged so neatly they looked unused. I moved carefully, almost holding my breath, afraid that my presence alone might stain the air. I remember the chair, before I remember the mistake. It was leather, black and immaculate, positioned behind a wide desk like a throne. The space around it was too clean, too controlled, too intentional. My arms were burning from mopping. My eyelids felt heavy like wet cloth. I told myself I would sit for 1 minute, just one, just long enough to stop the room from spinning. The leather was colder than I expected. The moment I sank into it, something in my body gave up. My head tipped back. The ceiling lights blurred. 1 minute turned into darkness. I woke to silence, so sharp it felt like a sound. A shadow stretched across the desk, precise and unmoving. I sat up too fast, heart slamming, and that's when I saw him. Namgung Seunggyeom stood in the doorway as if he'd always been there, his suit untouched by the night, his gaze cutting straight through me. He didn't shout. He didn't rush forward. He simply looked at me, at the chair, at my uniform, at the exhaustion I couldn't hide, like I was an unsolved problem. I started to stammer an apology, already imagining my dismissal, already tasting humiliation. He took 1 step closer, eyes narrowing, not with anger but calculation. Then, in a voice so calm it frightened me more than yelling ever could, he asked, "How long has Haeyeon been sick?" The question didn't belong in that room. It didn't belong in his mouth. I remember how my stomach dropped, how my hands went cold around the mop handle, as if my body understood the danger before my mind did. I hadn't told anyone his name on that floor. I hadn't spoken about Haeyeon at work. I had trained myself not to, because pity turned into gossip, and gossip turned into problems I couldn't afford. Seunggyeom watched me scramble for an explanation the way someone watches a locked door. Patient. Expecting. His office felt less like a workplace and more like a sealed container, air filtered, surfaces spotless, the edges of everything aligned so perfectly it looked unreal. Even the silence seemed arranged. A pen lay parallel to the desk's corner, a stack of documents squared with a ruler's precision. When my cleaning cloth brushed a frame and shifted it a fraction, I saw his eyes flick to it instantly, sharp as a blade. He stepped forward and corrected it without thinking, one smooth movement, as if his body couldn't tolerate disorder. He didn't touch the chair I'd slept in. He didn't need to. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped the desk where my fingers had been, then slipped it away like evidence. Not anger, control. The kind that didn't ask permission. After the hospital, that same control wrapped itself around my life like a net. A car was waiting when I stepped outside, black and silent at the curb. A driver opened the door before I reached it. Two men stood nearby, not in uniform, but positioned too carefully to be ordinary. Seunggyeom didn't explain them as guards. He spoke of them the way you speak of locks. Necessary. Routine. He arranged a place near the hospital, so you don't waste time commuting, he said, as if my whole existence could be solved by efficiency. The apartment was clean in a way that made me afraid to breathe. Shoes lined perfectly by the door. The scent of antiseptic faint in the air. On the kitchen counter sat a small bottle of sanitizer, a fresh pack of wipes, and a printed schedule with times blocked down to the minute. My name was typed at the top. Gratitude pressed against my ribs until it hurt. So did fear. Because if his help was a gift, why did it feel like rules? Why did every convenience come with invisible walls? I held Haeyeon closer that night, listening for sounds in the hallway, trying to decide whether I had been rescued or collected. My phone rang just after midnight, the hospital's number. I answered on the first ring, because promises had teeth. The nurse's voice came out tight and low. "Ms. Eom, we have a problem." A pause, like she was choosing words that wouldn't shatter me. "Someone accessed your son's file and changed part of his treatment paperwork." The words blurred for a moment after the nurse spoke, as if my mind refused to let them settle. Changed paperwork. Accessed file. Those were the kind of phrases that belonged to strangers with authority, not to a mother who still smelled faintly of detergent and sleep deprivation. I pressed my palm to my forehead and tried to breathe through the sudden dizziness. Haeyeon was already fragile. He didn't have room for problems. I was at the hospital before the sky even softened. The corridor lights were still harsh, the air cold enough to sting my lungs. When I reached the counter, the nurse didn't meet my eyes. She slid a clipboard toward me with a gloved hand, the way you might slide something sharp. The bill that had been stamped paid in red, paid in full, was suddenly flagged again. A system discrepancy, they called it. A billing error that shouldn't have existed had returned like a ghost. On another page, a medication order had been altered, a dosage line changed by a name I didn't recognize. Because of it, the next part of Haeyeon's treatment was on hold. On hold. I stared at those words until my vision swam. They meant waiting. They meant delays. They meant minutes turning into consequences. My hands began to shake so badly the pen tapped against the paper. I wanted to scream, but fear swallowed sound. Fear that if I made noise, they'd push me out. Fear that if I begged too loudly, they'd decide I was difficult and my son would pay the price. That was when the truth landed heavy in my chest. This wasn't a mistake. Someone had reached into my child's care and moved things around like pieces on a board. And I was the piece they could hurt easiest. My phone felt like a weapon in my hand. I didn't want to call him. I didn't want to owe him more than I already did. But Haeyeon's room was down the hall, and I could almost hear the thinness of his breathing. When Seunggyeom's name appeared on my screen, it was as if he'd already known. I didn't have to explain much. The moment I said the words billing error and changed order, the air around me shifted. I watched him move through the hospital like the building belonged to him, not loud, not violent, just inevitable. People lowered their voices. Administrators appeared too quickly. The head nurse's posture straightened like she'd been pulled by a string. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten with fists. He threatened with calm. He produced the receipt, the proof, and let silence do the cutting. He asked for access logs. He asked who touched the file. He asked who benefited. And when excuses started to form, his gaze hardened in a way that made the room feel smaller. "Fix it," he said, quiet as a closing door. "Or I will." Treatment resumed within the hour. I should have felt relief. Instead, as I sat beside Haeyeon and watched the drip begin, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Stop asking questions, or the boy suffers." The message sat on my screen like a bruise that wouldn't fade. I read it again and again, as if repetition might turn it into something less real. My fingers went numb around the phone. Across the room, Haeyeon slept, his chest rising and falling in tiny, careful motions, and I hated how quickly fear could make me imagine that rhythm stopping. I didn't show the nurse. I didn't show the doctor. I didn't trust anyone in a building where someone could touch my child's life with a password and a careless hand. When Seunggyeom arrived, he didn't ask why I'd called. He looked at my face once and already knew. I held the phone out like a confession. He read the message without blinking. No surprise, no anger, just a quiet tightening around his eyes, the way a door latch clicks into place. "This is why you promised," he said. I swallowed hard. "You said it was one promise. You didn't say it would make my son a target." His gaze didn't soften, but his voice dropped lower, careful. "You were already a target the moment you became useful to someone. The promise wasn't to control you." He paused, and for the first time I heard something beneath his calm, something like urgency sealed under discipline. "It's to keep you alive long enough for us to find who's touching your son." My stomach twisted at the word us, as if we were partners, as if I had ever wanted to stand beside a man like him. "I'm just a cleaner," I whispered. "I don't know anything." "You know more than you think," he replied. "Because people don't see you. They talk around you. They move in front of you. They leave their mistakes where you can find them." I hated that he was right. My whole life, I'd learned to be quiet enough to survive. In hallways and offices, invisibility had been a shield. Now he wanted to turn it into a weapon. He asked me for simple things that suddenly felt dangerous. Names on badges, the time a nurse entered, which administrator avoided eye contact, which folder looked newly printed, whose hands hovered too long over a chart. He wasn't asking me to fight. He was asking me to watch, to remember, to tell him everything. I looked at Haeyeon and felt my pride crumble under the weight of my love. "Fine," I said, the word tasting bitter. "I'll help." Seunggyeom nodded once, as if the decision had been inevitable. Later, outside the room, I stepped into the corridor and froze when I heard voices around the corner. Low, familiar, confident. "Keep her close," one man said. "She's an asset now." And in that moment, the floor beneath my agreement shifted, and I realized I wasn't just protecting my son. I'd been placed on someone's board. The word asset followed me back into the apartment like a shadow I couldn't shake off. I washed my hands until my skin stung, not because they were dirty, but because I wanted to scrub the feeling away of being counted, placed, used. Even in the quiet, I could hear the hospital monitor in my head, that steady beep reminding me why I was swallowing my fear at all. Seunggyeom arrived without announcing himself, as if doors didn't exist for him the way they did for other people. He didn't ask if I was all right. He looked once at my face and moved straight to the sink, turning the tap on with a controlled precision, rinsing his hands like he was removing more than water. He wiped the counter afterward, aligning the sanitizer bottle so the label faced forward, exactly centered, like disorder was something that could summon disaster. I couldn't hold it in anymore. The question pushed out of me in a whisper that shook. Why me? Why did he pay? Why did this feel like protection and prison at the same time? For a moment, his composure cracked, not into anger but into something older, something buried. He didn't sit. He stood near the window, watching the city lights like they were an enemy line. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual, almost careful, as if the truth had edges. When he was a child, someone he loved had needed help. Urgent, simple help that became impossible once time ran out. The money had come late, not hours late, not days late, late in the way that counts forever. He said he remembered the waiting room smell more clearly than the person's face at the end because his mind had tried to protect him from what he couldn't fix. Since then, he had learned that deadlines didn't only belong to bills, they belonged to hearts. I didn't pay because I'm good, he admitted, the words flat with honesty. I paid because I couldn't not. The confession should have softened him in my eyes. Instead, it made him more frightening, because it meant this wasn't charity. It was obsession. It was a wound that never healed. Later, while he took a call in the other room, I moved through the apartment like I always had, quiet, careful, invisible. A folder sat half-hidden beneath a stack of perfectly squared papers. My name was typed on the tab. Eom Saeeun. Inside were hospital details about Haeyeon, dates, notes, even the ward number, printed and organized. And on the first page, the timestamp made my breath disappear. It was dated before the night I fell asleep in his chair. The timestamp on that folder burned behind my eyes even after I closed it. I moved through the next hours like I was walking on thin ice, careful not to crack, careful not to be seen. If Seunggyeom had known about Haeyeon before the chair, then the hospital wasn't the start of this. It was only where the net finally tightened. He didn't deny it when I let the silence speak for me. He didn't apologize either. He simply turned that same calm into a plan, cold, precise, and clean enough to leave no fingerprints. We didn't chase the enemy with force. We chased them with proof. He had the hospital's access logs pulled quietly, not through threats, but through pressure that sounded like policy. Audits, compliance, the kind of words that make people sweat in expensive offices. I did my part the way I always had, by being invisible. I watched who lingered near the nurses' station when no one was watching. I noted which administrator's hands moved too fast over the printer, which badge was used twice in places it shouldn't be. I caught the small things. A chart refiled in the wrong color, a form stamped in a hurry, a second phone slipped into a drawer the moment footsteps approached. Seunggyeom seeded one clean thread into the system, a single updated document in Haeyeon's file with a tiny, deliberate marker that meant nothing to anyone who wasn't looking. Then we waited. The hook worked. By afternoon, the marker showed up where it shouldn't have, copied, printed, and attached to a transfer request that had never been approved. The name on the access record wasn't a doctor's. It belonged to a mid-level billing administrator, someone ordinary enough to blend into the background, someone who could move paper and permissions without drawing attention. The same person who had avoided my eyes since Seunggyeom first appeared. When Seunggyeom presented the evidence, timestamps, access trails, camera angles, a quiet money trail that didn't match a hospital salary, the administrator's face drained of color so fast it looked like illness. The truth spilled without anyone raising a hand. Someone had been paid to interfere. Someone outside the hospital wanted Haeyeon's treatment to become chaos. And then the last piece clicked into place like a lock. It wasn't only Haeyeon they were aiming at. It was Seunggyeom. My son was the bait, and I was the string tied to his wrist, the proof he had a weakness worth pulling. I was still trying to swallow that when a nurse ran toward us, breathless, eyes wide. "Ms. Eom, your son," she gasped. "They just moved Haeyeon. There's an emergency transfer order." My heart dropped so hard I felt it in my knees. Because I hadn't signed anything. My body moved before my mind did. I ran, shoes slapping against the hospital floor, the hallway stretching too long, the lights too bright. Every door I passed felt like a chance to lose him. When I reached the ward, the bed where Haeyeon had been was empty, sheets pulled tight, as if he'd never existed there at all. A nurse tried to speak, but I couldn't hear her over the roar in my ears. Then Seunggyeom was beside me, close enough that his calm felt like a wall. He didn't shout. He didn't panic. He spoke to the staff with a quiet authority that made hands freeze mid-motion. He demanded the transfer order. He demanded the signature. He demanded the timestamp. His gaze swept the room like a blade, and within minutes the lie collapsed under its own paperwork. Haeyeon was found 2 floors down in a transport bay, still half asleep, his blanket tucked too neatly by hands that didn't love him. I snatched him up so fast the nurse gasped, and I buried my face against his hair just to convince myself he was real. His small fingers curled into my collar, and the tremble that had been trapped in my chest finally shook loose. When it was over, When the doors were locked again, when the staff returned to their careful normal, I turned on Seungyeom with a fury that had been building since the moment he slid his card across that counter. "My son is not your leverage," I said, voice cracking but loud enough to hurt. "Not for your enemies, not for your guilt, not for your control, I will not be owned." For the first time, something crossed his face that looked like regret. Not soft regret. The kind that comes from realizing your instinct to protect has the same shape as a cage. "You think I want to own you," he said quietly. "You act like it," I shot back. "You decide where I sleep, who drives me, what I can say. You call it protection, but it feels like chains made of silk." He held my gaze, and I saw the fight in him, the part that wanted to tighten his grip, to lock the world into order so nothing could be taken again. His flaw wasn't cruelty. It was control disguised as safety. Then he did something I didn't expect. He reached into his coat and pulled out the contract folder. With one clean motion, he tore through it. Paper split. Rules fell apart. He dropped the pieces into the trash like they were nothing. "You keep your freedom," he said. "I keep you alive." He took out a new sheet, short, simple, and slid it toward me. No ownership. No silence. No open-ended demands. Only boundaries. Protection until the threat was gone, full access to my son's care, and one final promise that belonged to me as much as him. "I will not touch what is yours," he said, "and your son will never be used again." I stared at the paper, then at Haeyeon, then back at Seungyeom. He lowered his voice, almost to himself. "Promise fulfilled." A pause. Then his eyes hardened, scanning past me toward the corridor like he could already feel the next wave coming. But the danger isn't over yet. Later, when the hospital finally quieted and Haeyeon's breathing settled into a steady rhythm, the world didn't feel victorious. It felt fragile, like something precious that could still crack if handled the wrong way. I sat beside my son and watched the rise and fall of his chest, the smallest motion in the room and yet the only one that mattered. In the reflection of the window, I could see my own face, tired, older than I should have been, but still here, still fighting. It would be easy to tell this story like it was about a powerful man who paid a bill and changed a life. People love that version, the rescuer, the savior, the dramatic entrance. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was that I stood on the edge of something unbearable and didn't jump. I kept walking. I signed when I had to, questioned when it was dangerous, and refused to let my child become anyone's currency. The money mattered, yes, because it bought time. But time is only the beginning of healing. Without safety, money is just paper. Without dignity, help becomes a chain. Desperation can force impossible choices. It can make you accept deals you would have sworn you never touch. And that doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. Survival isn't shameful when the world gives you no soft landings. But help that removes your choices isn't love. It's control dressed up in kindness. Real help doesn't demand your silence. It doesn't shrink your freedom. It doesn't turn your gratitude into a cage. Real help respects boundaries, even when it's inconvenient. And power, real power, isn't proven by domination. It's proven by restraint. By the ability to protect without possessing, to lead without crushing, to hold the line without taking what doesn't belong to you. Most of all, children should never become leverage in adult conflicts. No debt, no rivalry, no ego is worth an innocent life. Protect the innocent first, always. As I watched Haeyeon sleep, I understood something I hadn't before. Healing isn't only money. Healing is truth. It's safety. It's dignity. It's support without strings attached. And if you were in my place, if your child's life depended on it, would you accept $48,700 for one promise to save them? Comment what you would do, and subscribe for the next story.